Your eyes open to a cold that bites like a stray dog. Dawn is hours away. A 9th century wind squeezes through the gaps in the timber walls and needles your skin. The straw crackles under your shoulder blades. Outside, the sound you dread, hooves. In mud, oars slapped into creeks. Men laughing in a language you don't know. Vikings, no flags, no globe-spanning fleet, no pink smears on a classroom map. Before empire, there is only survival. Britain is a patchwork kingdoms with names that sound like drum beats. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and the raiders are getting bolder. Monasteries burn, silver vanishes, people vanish. The smoke smells like peat and panic. Word breaks like a wave. The Danes are coming. Across low fields, the thatch lines up like kindling. Children are lifted. Pots and saints' bones are scooped into sacks. Somewhere to the west, a king is running out of places to hide. He's Alfred, King of Wessex, though king feels. Generous when you're reduced to marshes and whispers. He vanishes into the Somerset levels, a world of reeds and shifting ground. If you've never walked a bog, imagine a floor that grabs your ankles and doesn't always return them. The air tastes like iron and wet wood. Sleep is a rumor. Fires are small and careful. But the marsh has two talents. It conceals and it teaches. Here, Alfred does the thing that almost no conqueror expects a beaten man to do. He rethinks England, not a new sword, a new plan. He studies where the land is friend and where it is traitor. He summons men who aren't soldiers, farmers, tanners. Swineherds, and teaches them to be just dangerous enough. He imagines a country that doesn't sprint from crisis to crisis, but stands its ground. Fortified towns, burrs spaced like a net. Roads that let fighters flow like water to whatever hole the enemy pokes. A navy that can force a boarding fight instead of getting harried to splinters. Most kings react. Alfred engineers, and then he gambles. He calls the survivors to a rendezvous point, egg birds, stone-like, a spark calling to tinder. You arrive. With whatever you have, a rehafted axe, a spear cut down from an ash sapling, faith. A priest blesses everything and everyone because it can't hurt. Eddington is not a picture in a textbook. It's a roaring throat of mud and fear. Shields kiss and bite. The ground swallows balance. Every collision smells like raw iron. The men beside you are half-trained, wholly determined. On the other side, Guthrum's veterans, hard with victories. The line bulges, contracts, screams. When it finally gives, it is not the clean victory of legend. It's exhaustion winning by an inch. Guthrum bends. He's baptized, ridden in water, then withdraws. And a line is drawn between worlds, the Danelaw to the north and east, a living England to the south and west. It is not peace, exactly. It's breathing room. The genius isn't that Alfred wins a battle. It's that he turns a kingdom into a system. Fortified burrs humming like hive cells. Musters timed by distance, not hope. Ships with higher sides. So Danish longboats can't simply leap in and own the deck. Bureaucracy and brick become weapons. After Alfred, the island is less a pasture and more a machine. Generations roll. Alfred's descendants push, test, consolidate. Ethelstan, Alfred's grandson, welds the rival English polities into something you can finally call a single realm. For the first time, the island speaks a coherent political sentence. England. Don't romanticize it. If you're a peasant under the new unity, your mornings still begin in the dark. Plough, mend, count what little you have, pray the weather listens. One king doesn't fill a pantry, but unity changes the direction of force. For centuries, the island's story has been reacting to blows from the sea. Now it begins to store power, like a cliff storing wind. That stored power draws attention. In 1066, sails bloom along the southern horizon. William of Normandy arrives with cavalry, archers, and an idea that a sharper, more centralized state can squeeze more out of land than a mosaic of lords ever could. He wins at Hastings, a French-speaking elite seizes an English-speaking country. Castles reel, stone-jawed castles bite into the landscape. Doomsday clerks count everything that breathes or grows, and tax becomes muscle, not suggestion. You can feel the pivot. Authority migrates from huts and halls to records and walls. The king's justice stretches its legs. Roads knit. Ports learn to load faster. Warfare apprentices under administration. Centuries later, when English ships swagger into monsoon harbors and Caribbean roads, they'll sail under masts built in forests mapped to the acre, for a crown that knows where every penny sleeps at night. Empire needs more than courage. It needs paperwork, and yet the island remains a rough classroom. Wales fights, then falls to a ring of English castles, meant less to repel foreigners than to remind locals who's boss. Ireland is poked and pressed by Anglo-Norman lords who arrive with swords and charters and stay for generations. Scotland refuses to be a collectible. The Channel never widens. France is always a day's sail away and frequently a problem. Then the ocean itself changes meaning. In the late medieval dark, sailors test coastlines like a blind man testing furniture. By the late 1400s, Europeans stop hugging shores and start gambling on horizons. A Genoese sailor misreads a planet and bumps into a hemisphere. Portuguese caravels fold Africa into a cape and discover oceans as global corridors, not barriers. The island watchers, late to the party, hungry. England will not become an empire because of a single eureka. It will arrive there by layers. Survival, then system, then appetite. The apprenticeship is long. The island learns how to count, how to make violence boring and reliable, how to argue with popes and replace them, how to write a contract that can outlast a man's breath. That's where part one leaves you, not with a crown planted over half the world, but with a kingdom that has learned how to endure, then how to plan. It has turned swamps into strategy, strategy into structure. It's not yet a global power, but the muscle groups an empire needs: administration, taxation, shipbuilding, law on the island now, stretching in the grey light. When the Atlantic opens, England will be ready to step through. Asterisk, picture a room where maps lie like rumours. Candles, gutter, names change with the turn of a sleeve. Hispaniola, Cuba, New Spain. Silver is being dragged out of mountains a world away. Spain points at the sunset and calls it theirs. Portugal draws a line down Africa and calls it neat. France licks its quill and signs the future. England's still punching above its incomes the door, before any Union Jack flaps over half the tropics. There's a smaller, messier push. It starts, awkwardly, next door. In the 1170s, Anglo-Norman fists reach across the Irish Sea. Henry II steps onto Irish soil with banners, bishops, and a belief that papal paperwork plus sharp steel equals legitimacy. Gaelic lords pivot between alliance and resistance. Submission is the word in English mouths. Occupation is the word Irish tongues will remember. Ireland becomes a template England returns to. Conquest, colonization, castles, councils, and a claim that order is charity when you're on top of it. Wales feels that template earlier. Edward I's castles work like iron teeth, not just to keep the French out, but to keep the Welsh in. Scotland refuses that bite and keeps its jaw. These are imperial rehearsals. Subdue a periphery, plant garrisons, move law like a caravan. Then the sea shouts. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian with an English license to dream, aims his small ship, Matthew, at an idea and strikes Newfoundland. The catch isn't gold yet. It's kudamis of it enough to feed a continent's Fridays. Cabot plants a flag because that's what Europeans do when they find someone else's home. He sails back with proof. The Atlantic isn't emptiness. It's a bridge you can cross if you can stomach the crossing. But claiming and keeping are different verbs. Early English colonization is clumsy. Roanoke flickers and goes out, leaving the word Croatoan carved into a trunk like a shrug from a ghost. Sir Walter Raleigh sells a dream. The dream eats its deposit and leaves. Meanwhile, Spain sails in squadrons, tall, slow, heavy with men and guns. England answers with speed and audacity. Drake and Hawkins raid like mosquitoes that carry plagues, buzzing, lethal. In 1588, the two styles collide. The Spanish Armada fills the horizon like a dark wall. English fireships break its order. Weather does the rest. When those battered hulks limp home, England earns not an empire but a permission slip to try for one. The lesson hits home. The sea is the battlefield that matters, and sea power doesn't mean the biggest ship. It means the navy that can choose. Where the fight happens, now slide the frame from war to commerce, because empires cost money and make it. The English crown learns the trick the Dutch are about to perfect. Private capital do risky things for public goals. Chartered companies are the cheat code. A monarch hands out monopoly rights like golden tickets. Merchants pool risk and, by steal, private greed subsidizes national reach. Enter the East India Company in 1600, a legal fiction with cannons, a boardroom that can hire an army. Its charter is a key that opens doors you can't even see from London. At Surat, on India's west coast, the company humbles itself to Mughal power, bowing to emperors, bargaining for warehouses, learning that when you're the new kid, you don't swagger, you count, you memorize tides, you hire local pilots who know which sandbar is a lie. You bring cloth the court likes and silver it loves. Trade follows good manners. Power follows trade. Asterisk. Across the Atlantic, another company points at a swamp and calls it the start of something. December 1606, 3 small ships leave the Thames, with 104 souls and more wishes than wheat. By May, they nose into a river and plant Jamestown, on an island that will try to kill them in every way a place can. Mosquitoes write their names in blood. The water is brackish, the soil sulks. The summers are heavy with fever, and the winters like knives. The Powhatan Confederacy looks at these strangers and sees both menace and opportunity. Some days are barter, some days are arrows. The starving time strips off any romance rats become meals, then leather, then rumors darker than either. Jamestown survives the way most early English colonies do, by luck, then by a crop. Tobacco floats the settlement like a plank floats a drowning man. It's hard on soil, hard on bodies, perfect for markets. Plantations become machines for export. Someone asks the question that will stain centuries: who will do labor that breaks backs and shortens lives? At first, poor Englishmen indentured themselves, time-bound servitude with a ticket at the end if disease doesn't collect its due. But the Caribbean is about to redraw morality around profit. On small islands Barbados, Nevis, Antigua, sugar becomes a hurricane of money that never stops spinning. Sugar is hunger in plant form. It devours land, wood, human years. White, indentured laborers can run or die. Planters look to Africa already entangled by Portuguese and Spanish slavers and decide a human being can be an input like timber. A legal architecture sprouts to make the monstrous feel tidy. Codes, ledgers, ships with holds redesigned to stack despair. This is not a side story. It becomes a spine of the First British Empire. If you need a scene to anchor the cruelty, imagine a tropical noon that doesn't end because the workday ignores the sun. Cane fields squeal with knives. Overseers measure time in lashes. Life expectancy is a rumor. Replacement is cheaper than care. Sugar sweetens teacups in London and rots teeth and republics in equal measure. Britain will later abolish the trade and then slavery itself inside its empire. That doesn't erase the wealth it banked or the lives it spent to get there. Meanwhile, in New England, a different kind of colony sketches itself on granite and conscience. The Mayflower is a tiny thing built for wine, not oceans. She limps across anyway. Plymouth scrapes through a winter that kills half its people. The survivors are taught how to live here by Wampanoag neighbors whose generosity collides with English demand for land. A decade later, Puritans pour into Massachusetts Bay, convinced God's eye watches Boston, and Boston better act accordingly. They're not tolerant in any modern sense. Ask the Quakers they whip, the dissenters they banish, but they build literacy, town meetings, and habits of local self-rule that will later glare at imperial orders and say, no. What ties these scattered experiments together is water. Harbors breed shipyards. Shipyards breed skills. Skills breed confidence. England starts to think, in public and on paper, in terms of roots god to market, tobacco to the Thames, cloth to Surat, pepper back to Bristol. Insurance brokers in coffee houses write calculus into risk. London becomes a place where the world's goods come to be repriced and redistributed. The empire is not yet an empire. It's a network, messy, often violent, curiously resilient. There are still larger predators in the water. Spain is wounded but rich. France is quick with muskets and alliances. The Dutch are geniuses at turning wind into money and money into ships. England's comparative advantage is stubbornness braided to institutions. Parliament can fund navies without begging. Courts can enforce contracts across oceans. The Crown can grant monopolies that bundle greed to strategy. And when war returns, as it always does, it will be global, almost by accident. A fight begun over boundaries in Pennsylvania will topple Quebec and reshape India. A skirmish in Bengal will blow open a century of company rule. The island is tied, by ambition and account book, to places its peasants can't pronounce. That's the hinge we're reaching. Before we cross it, hold two truths in the same hand. The first, English expansion births experiments that modern audiences admire: elected assemblies, printed dissent, the possibility that ordinary people can push back against power with law and words. The second, it also births systems whose purpose is extraction of sugar, of furs, of taxes, of choice from people who did not ask for any of this. Those contradictions aren't a glitch. They're the operating system of the First British Empire, liberty at home, hierarchy abroad, rights for some, rules for others. The story will widen, armies will grow, and the map will get drunk on pink. But the DNA, a commercial nerve, naval reach, legal wrappers around violences, already been written in salt and ink. Next, the fuse. A small river fort in Bengal, a fort on the St. Lawrence, and a 22-year-old Virginian who signs a document he doesn't quite understand. When those sparks hit powder, the empire stops being a rehearsal and starts being the main act. Asterisk, the forest is too quiet. Pennsylvania trees crowd the track like eavesdroppers, and the path you're guarding is narrow enough to make a colonel sweat. Red coats flash through branches. Drums thud against ribs. The summer air wraps around you like a wet cloth. Then the forest explodes, cracks and flashes from everywhere and nowhere. Horses scream. Men drop. The road to empire, it turns out, goes straight through an ambush. Years later, maps will rename this chaos the 7 Years' War. But on the ground, it's older and uglier. Britain and France can't share a hemisphere without turning it into a chessboard. Furs, farmland, river mouths, and fort junctions become moves. Nations become players. Local peoples become leveraged. A young George Washington signs a French surrender paper he barely understands, and somewhere a fuse finds powder. The war is global by accident and design. In North America, British columns push into forests with European confidence and meat. Lessons written in bark and shadow. Braddock's defeat near the Monongahela teaches a horrible arithmetic. Rank and file don't matter when the woods choose who lives. But Britain has a strength the continent can't see yet, the sea. If you can control who arrives, you can choose who wins. So the Navy gets busy. In 1758, ships crowd the fog off Cape Breton Island. The fortress of Louisbourg squats on its rock, like a dare. Artillery claws at stone day after day, until granite remembers it can break. Smoke rolls. The tricolour comes down. The Gulf of St. Lawrence opens like a door on oiled hinges, and British commanders look a priver to the cliff-ringed heart of New France. Quebec sits above the Saint, Lawrence like a hand on a throat. The obvious approaches are killboxers. The currents are sly, the heights are steep. General James Wolfe, sickly and sharp, tries and fails, then gambles on the path no one expects. Midnight oars in muffled locks. Men breathe through cloth, the dark taste of the river in your mouth, boat's nose. Toward a goat path a fisherman swore existed. When the sun lifts its head, red coats stand on the plains of Abraham, muskets primed, drums quiet. It looks like a magic trick. It is only nerve. The fight is fast and final. Wolfe falls, Montcalm falls, Quebec cracks. A year later, Montreal lets go, and the French canopy that has shaded half a continent gets folded and carried away. North America redraws itself in British ink, but this isn't just a Canadian story. The war's echo booms in India. Too, on a riverbank where monsoon air presses on your lungs and the ground remembers every footstep. Bengal is rich, a tapestry of river silt and accountants' ledgers. Whoever skims its surface fattens. When the Nawab Siraj-Dowlah seizes Calcutta and the company crumples into panic. A story forms the black hole, a night of heat, crowding, and suffocation that Britain will repeat endlessly to crown its vengeance with virtue. Robert Clive steps into frame, a clerk turned soldier, wired like a gambler. At Plassey in 1757, The armies face each other beneath skies the color of melted pewter. Numbers favor the Nawab. Fate favors the side with better paperwork. Clive has arranged something more decisive than courage. Treason purchased at a competitive rate. When Mir Jafar's contingents decide the battle isn't their problem, the outcome becomes a question of time and rain. The company wins, installs a puppet, and writes itself a new job description. Not trader, tax collector, asterisk. That's the hinge. Empires of trade morph into empires of rule when somebody hands you the keys to a treasury and you decide you deserve them. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, Britain pockets Canada, Florida, island jewels in the Caribbean. In India, the East India Company pretends to bow while weighing the land like a butcher weighing cuts. Britain's enemies are broke. Britain is rich, the navy struts, the flag multiplies. But the bill is already in the mail. Debt piled up like cordwood to pay for all this winning. Back in America, the king draws a line on the map of power as boundary to avoid new fights with indigenous nations who've had enough of forts appearing like bad weather. Pontiac's coalition rises to prove the point. British garrisons are pinched, besieged, taught humility. The frontier learns once again that geography picks friends and enemies without asking you first. London sees costs. Colonists see fences. Resentments, like rivers, find their slope. If you were in a London coffeehouse in 1763, the room would hum with certainty. A global empire, stitched by sea lanes and insurance policies. Sugar islands pouring white gold. Cod and timber and furs turning into coin. Bengal revenues cushioning debt. But there's a sour aftertaste. Governing costs money and obedience. Colonists who cheered British drums at Louisbourg now count taxes with narrowed eyes. Company men who bowed in Mughal courts now hire sepoys and imagine themselves kings. France is wounded but not dead, and wounded rivals throw strange punches. The war made Britain master of more than it could comfortably carry and of peoples who didn't consent to be carried. Victory is a crown. It's also a weight. Under it, the spine can curve. And something else slipped into place almost quietly. A formula. Naval reach plus credit plus chartered companies plus local alliances plus shameless opportunism equals territorial power. It worked at Quebec. It worked at Plassey. It will work elsewhere until it doesn't. For now, the globe spins with more pink on it. Harbours. Across 3 oceans fly the same flag. London's bankers write the same numbers. And in taverns in Boston and back rooms in Calcutta, men sharpen words like knives. The empire believes it has secured the world. In truth, it has set the stage for 2 revolutions, one that will walk out of the empire, one that will swallow it whole for a century. Asterisk, imagine night on a cold harbour. Masts web the sky. The smell is tar and salt and something sweeter tea. Leaves, stacked in chests with names of far coasts, stamped in ink. Then boots on planks, cloaks pulled close, men with faces smeared. Lids crack, chests tip, and the Atlantic drinks 92,000 pounds of ritual. It makes a noise like applause. The empire has been insulted in its favorite language, commerce. No. Taxation without representation isn't poetry. It's billing complaints written by people who think they've earned the right to be asked first. Stamp Act, Townshend duties, soldiers quartered. Trials shifted. Every measure reads like a parent slapping a teenager's hand off the coin jar. The teenager has a printing press. Pamphlets breed. Crowds gather. Snowballs in Boston carry stones. In their hearts, shots crack. and 5 men fall into the cold March slush. Massacre, the broadsides scream, because rage needs a word. And that one works. London keeps mistaking noise for disloyalty and obedience for respect. The coercive acts aim to make an example of Boston. Instead, they make an example of London's. Misreading, militias drill behind barns, lanterns swing. On Lexington Green, history shrugs and fires first. War in these colonies is a workshop for improvisation. The Continental Army is held together by will, French loans, and George Washington's stubborn jaw. Valley Forge gnaws at bone. Then the French enter, because France knows how to lose one continent and take revenge by proxy on another. At Saratoga, the world notices. At Yorktown, the trap closes. Cornwallis submits his sword while his band plays the world turned upside down, which is exactly how it feels in London when the news arrives. The empire loses 13 stripes on its flag and gains something else, clarity. If North America wants to be a republic, find there are other maps, other margins. The pivot is brutal and fast. The shipping routes don't vanish, they reroute. Convicts who once rode west now sail south to a place Cook charted, and the Admiralty turned into a solution, a penal colony at the world's far edge. Botany Bay in 1788 feels like exile from the map itself. New stars, new soil, First Nations watching strangers build a second-hand England out of scarcity and orders. The first fleet's chains rattle into a new kind of settlement, one that begins as punishment and grows into mythology. Across the Indian Ocean, the company stops pretending it is a guest. With the Treaty of Allahabad, 1765, it already held the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, Orissa the Diwani, that transforms traders into tax farmers. By the 1790s and early 1800s, men like Cornwallis and Wellesley are wrapping velvet language around iron logic. Subsidiary alliances that guard Indian rulers with British bayonets and British accountants attached. Pay for the troops that protect you, take advice you can't refuse, sign what's placed in front of you. Conquest isn't always banners and drums. Sometimes it's double-entry bookkeeping and a regiment parked in your courtyard. Money and morality argue in British parlour rooms. The sugar on the table remembers hands in cane fields. Ships remembered by their smell salt. Rope, fear begin to feel like an indictment. The abolition movement learns to use the empire's own tools, pamphlets, petitions, prints of the Brooks slave ship to teach a public to see the invisible. In 1807, Britain abolishes the trade in enslaved people. In 1833, it will abolish slavery. In most of its territories, between those dates, profits still hum and plantations still grind. Ending a trade is one thing. Ending the world that trade built is another. Britain recalibrates its self-story with breathtaking dexterity. It is now the empire that polices the Atlantic against slavers, its cruisers stopping ships off. West Africa and in the Caribbean, Navy captains writing new chapters where older ones burned. Meanwhile, in India, revenue is counted down to the last grain. In Australia, land is declared terra nullius, as if people living there for millennia were mirages. A moral pose doesn't erase a material habit, but the most important pivot is mechanical, not moral. In the damp north of England, machines begin to hum. Water frames and then steam engines rip the bottlenecks out of production. Cotton flows through Manchester like a river you can hold. Mills eat daylight and spit cloth. Industrialization is a furnace that needs fuel, coal, iron, and markets. The empire becomes both a source of inputs and a sink for outputs. Cloth goes out, cotton comes in. And somewhere a Bengali weaver looks at a silent loom and wonders when his skill became obsolete. The map thickens. The Cape Colony, snatched from the Dutch during Europe's Napoleonic convulsions, becomes a stepping stone to Indian Ocean routes. Ceylon and Malta do the same. Little points on the globe turn into hinges. Britain learns to think in terms of choke points. Control the straits, control the sea. Control the sea, control the trade. Control the trade, and you can afford to lose a colony and not lose your mind. In the colonies that walked away, Britain remains without ruling. The United States and Britain will fight again, squabble again, trade again, borrow each other's language and songs. In the places Britain still rules or newly annexes, it becomes both more bureaucratic and more confident. It speaks of improvement and civilization, of schools and law and roads, and it builds all three then as it melts resistance with artillery and pays for the lecture with taxes it imposes. By 1800, the empire that lost its most famous colonies is oddly stronger because it is clearer. It is maritime, financial, industrial, and increasingly shameless about using private power to do public work. The flag and the ledger help each other. The navy is the guarantee. The century ahead will test how far sails and steam can push this arrangement and what happens when a gunboat becomes a bargaining chip. You keep playing until someone flips the table. For now, the tea has sunk, the chains still clatter, and the cash registers ring. Britain learned something from losing America. Empires that last pivot fast, forget nothing, and add engines to their myths. Asterisk. Walk down a Manchester street in 1820 and you taste the century. Coal on the tongue, soot in the teeth. Windows wear a permanent dusk. Inside the mills, thousands of spindles sing at once. A metal storm that never stops. Children dart like nervous birds, overseers, sticks tap time. Steam breathes hot and damp against brick. This is power you can hear, and it wants more of everything. Industrial Britain is a factory with a navy attached. Steamships shorten oceans. Railways erase time on land. Telegraphs let London whisper to Bombay in minutes instead of months. The empire's metabolism spikes. Cotton from the American South, and then Egypt and India feeds the mills. Cheap cloth vomits back out across the world. Profits climb, and somewhere an artisan's market collapses because no hand can compete with a machine. In India, the transformation feels like a theft in slow motion. Bengal's famed muslin, so fine it could pass through a ring, becomes a memory. Company policies tilt the field. Tariffs that favor British imports. Revenue demands paid in cash, not kind. Incentives to grow indigo and opium instead of food. Fields change color. Blue where rice once grew. Poppy where millet fed children. In Calcutta counting houses, clerks enumerate what the land now owes. In villages, a weaver ties his loom with rope that belonged to his father and leaves it to dust. His daughter learns to pick indigo until her fingers stain. Britain tells itself a story to match its profits. Improvement, progress, civilization, words that make rail tracks sound like charity and treaties like gifts. In 1829, Governor-General Bentinck outlaws sati, the Hindu practice of widow burning. Missionaries preach. Macaulay pens his minute imagining Indian minds refashioned in English molds, and an Indian elite begins to grow that can quote Milton and measure a budget. Some reforms are genuine mercy, some are vanity. All arrive in a bundle tied with power. And then there's China. The Qing Empire is old, confident, and not buying what Britain is selling literally. The British appetite for tea is bottomless. The Chinese appetite for British manufactures is not. Silver flows east. London hates the drain. The solution is a poison that grows well in Indian fields, opium, smuggled through Canton, smoked in dens. It flips the balance sheet. Silver pours back west as Chinese bodies fail forward. Commissioner Linzexu does something rare in the age. He writes a letter that is both moral argument and diplomatic warning and backs it by seizing and destroying opium. Britain, champion of free trade when convenient, declares this an offense so severe that war is philanthropy. Gunboats idle in the Pearl River like sharks doing math. HMS Nemesis, an iron steamer that looks like the future, slides against wooden junks that look like tradition. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, is what happens when cannon write policy. Hong Kong handed over, ports opened, tariffs forced. Most favored nation, clauses that are really always favored Britain. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860 drives the lesson home with fire and humiliation, the looting and burning of the Summer Palace, a cultural wound that will ache into the next century. In Chinese memory, these are the unequal treaties era. In British memory, when it bothers to remember these are trade disputes, the truth is uglier. Britain went to war so it could keep selling drugs at gunpoint. The silver, the empire, wanted comes back. So does a reputation for hypocrisy, even among its own. Elsewhere the engines rewire geographies. The Suez is still a dream, but steam already bends capes and monsoons. At the Cape Colony, Britain sits on the hinge of the South. Atlantic and Indian Ocean like a palm on a doorknob. In West Africa, the Navy's anti-slavery patrols seize ships and free captives to Sierra Leone, turning Freetown into a living archive of broken voyages and attempted repairs. In the Caribbean, Emancipation, 1833, arrives with compensation for slave owners and apprenticeships that smell like the old system in new clothes. Plantations wobble, then swap one form of coerced labor for another, indenture. Ships fill with Indian laborers bound by contract to Trinidad, Guyana, Fiji, Natal. A new diaspora traces empire's arteries. Britain's industrial might also changes how it fights. At sea, steam and sail hybrids outrun weather. On land, railways move regiments at speeds Napoleon could not dream. The telegraph hums. Is Delhi holding? Send to regiments. Yes, now. The empire learns to project force, not just with ships and battalions, but with timetables. Efficiency becomes a virtue and an alibi. But there's a ceiling to how much you can change, how people live without breaking how they obey. In cantonments across North India, sepoys drill, pray, send, pay home, and drink water from separate vessels. Rumors spread about new rifle cartridges, greased with cow and pig fat, an offense that touches both Hindu sanctity and Muslim law. The company dismisses the anxiety, as institutions do when they've forgotten how to listen. Stocks of cartridges arrive anyway. What begins next will be called different names by different mouths. The Sepoy Mutiny, the Great Rebellion, the First War of Independence. Before the naming comes the noise. A parade ground at Mirate, an order refused, punishments that go too far. Rifles raised, then turned. Officers who never imagined death this close meet it at breakfast. Lines of telegraph wire pass, news like a gasp into a shout. The engines of empire made it fast. They also made it brittle. The year is 1857, and the company is about to discover what happens when a machine for profit pretends to be a nation. Asterisk may heat in North India has a weight. It presses on the skull. It shortens breath. It curls leaves. At Meerut, it does something else. It lowers a match. When sepoys refuse the Enfield cartridges, the company chooses to make an example instead of making amends. Shackles clink, whips crack. Soldiers who felt insulted now feel betrayed. That's the difference between grumbling and revolt. The uprising moves like summer wind sudden everywhere. In Delhi, the old Mughal city shakes itself and chooses a symbol. Bahadur Shah's afar, a poet king with more memory than power, is lifted onto a ghost throne. The red fort becomes a beacon. Across the Ganges plain, regiments mutiny, then towns rise, then villages decide the moment is now or never. Grievances, long catalogued land annexations, under the doctrine of lapse, priests whispering fears of forcible conversion, landlords broken by revenue demands, artisans ruined by imports goerless, into fury with a convenient object. The cartridges were only the match. The room had been filling with gas for years. Scenes blossom and stain in Kanpur. A siege hardens into massacre, women and children murdered in a cramped building beside a well. The British turn grief into steel. Newspapers back home turn it into license. When relief columns retake towns, mercy evaporates. Summary hangings in lines. Men blown from cannon muzzles so their bodies can't be ritually mourned. Villages torched as warnings. A revolt born in a barracks ends as a region-wide trauma. Delhi becomes the crucible. Rebel banners ripple over crenellations. British artillery answers with repetitive certainty. The city starves, bleeds, and learns how modern siege warfare hums. When the breach comes in September, street fighting turns neighborhoods into graves. The last Mughal emperor, old and exhausted, is captured. 2 of his sons are shot, their bodies displayed under the arch of a gate as a lesson. The empire has chosen the tone of its next 100 years, paternal when convenient, punitive when crossed. When the guns stop, the paperwork begins. London looks at Leadenhall Street, the East India Company's headquarters, sees the liability. It has become the Government of India Act 1858 strips the company of its crown. The Raj replaces a corporation. Queen Victoria's name now signs every order. A viceroy sits in Calcutta and later Delhi. The Indian civil service becomes the white spine of a brown subcontinent. It's a paradox. The rebellion that tried to eject foreign rule produces a version of it more formal, more thorough, more patient. Victoria's proclamation promises non-interference in religion, access to office by merit, even a royal tone that sounds respectful. On the ground, the system tightens. The IX recruits by exam supposedly open to all, but realistically designed for men trained in British classics, not Indian vernaculars. Railways multiply 6,000 miles, then 10,000 iron, stitching across rice fields. Telegraph poles march beside them like repeating punctuation. Troops can now be at your door before a rumour finishes its sentence. The British learn to balance insult and investment. Divide and rule becomes a rule. Recruitment pivots. Certain martial races are favoured. Regiments are ethnically sorted. Loyalties are tracked on charts. Law codifies property in new wasteland. Tenure shifts. Mortgages formalize. Police wear khaki. Courts wear wigs. Schools teach Wordsworth. The villagers hum with both opportunity and resentment. Famines teach the ugliest lessons. In the 1860s, 1870s, 1890s, rains fail in patterns as old as monsoons, and crops collapse into dust. Under older systems, grain stores and local obligations might have softened the fall. Under the new economy, rail and law and the idea of the market do strange work. Grain moves sometimes away from starving districts because price says so. Officials raised on laissez-faire hesitate to break the invisible hand. Millions pay in bone and breath. Drought is weather. Famine is policy. Asterisk. And yet, you can't tell the Roj only in dark colors. It poured capital into canals, built universities, founded surveys that measured mountains, and sponsored science that mapped skies. It trained Indian doctors, lawyers, engineersmen, and a few women who would later argue in flawless English that the English idea of liberty must apply to Indians, too. Every school that taught rights minted critics. Every court that taught due process trained a generation to sue for their country's future. Culturally, a complicated weave. Indian elites adopt British manners when useful and reject them when necessary. British officers learn Urdu couplets and forget them as they grow old. Mixed cities form where chapatis and cutlets share tables. The empire is not a wall. It's an exchange in equal, often cruel, but not impermeable. Outside India, Britain's reach lengthens as if trying to prove 1857 did not make it blink. The Suez Canal opens in 1869, and suddenly the map folds. What took a season now takes weeks. Bombay feels like a suburb of the city. British shares buy Egyptian debt. British warships protect investments. And the canal becomes a throat. London vows never to let an enemy choke. The Raj is no longer a faraway jewel. It's a quick telegram and a steamship ride away. By 1880, a new iron calm lies over the subcontinent. Not peace never, because people are people and power is a friction machine. But a system hums. Trains on time, court calendars full, budgets balanced to please bond markets in London, not stomachs in the Deccan. The memory of 1857 is curated in barracks and drawing rooms. Its lessons are on notice boards. Do not ignite. Watch the cartridges. Weigh the insults you cannot afford. Under that calm, a whisper starts to travel. Educated, bilingual, suited men writing essays and forming clubs. They think in English and in Bengali, in Marathi and in Urdu. They memorize Mill and Burke and the Gita. They start to phrase a question that is not a whisper at all. If we can run your courts, your railways, your budgets, why can we not run our own country? The empire answers, for now, with scholarships and schedules. The answer will not hold. Asterisk step into a Berlin drawing room in winter 1884. The air smells of pipe smoke and polished wood. On the walls, maps with generous blank spaces. Around the table, men in uniforms and frock coats arguing in French and German and English about lines they will draw on a continent most of them have never seen. No African leaders are invited. Pens glide, rulers slide, and mountains, rivers, and people are converted into angles. That's the scramble for Africa, a speed run of empire, carved by cartography and machine guns. Britain arrives with a handful of Lodestar's coaling stations. Trade arteries, strategic keys like the Cape and Suez, and a philosophy born of telegraphs and timetables. Choke points are destiny. Start with Egypt. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, transforms geography into finance. It turns the voyage to India from a story of capes and storms into a matter of weeks and invoices. When Egypt's Khedive drowns in debt, Disraeli buys a controlling share in the Canal Company in 1875 with borrowed money and swagger. "We have it," he says, and he's right, but only on paper. On the streets of Cairo in 1881–82, Colonel Ahmed Urabi and his supporters rise against a regime that's bankrupting the nation to please European creditors. Britain bombards Alexandria, defeats Urabi at Tel el-Kebir, and occupies the country temporarily. Temporary turns into decades. A garrison at Cairo, a consul general who behaves like a prime minister, the canal guarded like the empire's. Jugular maps of the Roj now hang in Suez offices. The empire has a new reflex arc. Push south and the Nile becomes both road and riddle. In Sudan, the Mahdi's revolt ignites a messianic movement against Ottoman Egyptian rule, tax collectors, and the distant meddling of Europeans. General Charles Gordon Soldier, mystic, celebrity ignores, orders to evacuate and fort up at Khartoum. The siege tightens. In London, public opinion becomes a drumbeat. Send relief. Steamers chug upriver too late. Khartoum falls in 1885. Gordon dies at the palace steps. Britain swallows the humiliation, then returns a decade later with iron arithmetic railway laid across desert, gunboats up the Nile, and the Maxim gun chewing through a Sudanese army at Omdurman in 1898. The casualty figures look like a typo: 11,000 Sudanese dead, 48 British. Technology has become a theology. The machine is destiny. And destiny conveniently flies the Union Jack. Turn west and you find a different British coastal forts fattened into colonies. Treaties obtained in mad dashes to outrun rival flags. The Gold Coast Lagos, the Niger Delta, river mouths with long economic arms into the interior. Royal Niger Company, another charter magic corporation, signs away sovereignty on battered verandas. Palm oil, cocoa, tin, and people men drafted for roads and rail flow toward. Ports built for export, not home. Lagos swells. Accra learns to inhale and exhale with steamer schedules. In southern Africa, the ground tilts under everyone's feet. The Cape Colony Dutch, then British. With a whole local universe of pastoral Boer republics meets the mineral age head-on. Diamonds at Kimberley, 1867. Gold on the Witwatersrand, 1886. Fortunes explode, towns sprout, and Cecil Rhodes dreams aloud of a red ribbon from Cape to Cairo stitched with rails and British will. His company state greed steps over boundaries as if they were suggestions. North into Matabele, he pushes, planting Rhodesia on the map as if naming were ownership. But greed breeds its own enemies. The Jamestown Raid, 1895–96, a clumsy, illegal attempt by Rhodes's ally to trigger an uprising in the Transvaal goes sideways, humiliating Britain and hardening Boer suspicion. Within 3 years, Boer and Brit are at war. The Second Boer War, 1899–1902, rips southern Africa open. It begins with British underestimation. Boer commandos farmers with Mausers on ponies, at home in the veldt-cut rails, ambush columns, and besiege garrisons. Early British reverses, Stormberg, Magersfontein, Colonsowen, the bitter nickname Black Week. The empire adjusts. It pours men, money, and machines into the theatre. Armoured trains rattle across open country. Blockhouse lines, fortlets wired together. Grid the landscape. Kitchener perfects a cruel arithmetic. Burn farms, seize livestock, deny food to fighters by punishing their families. And here the war crosses a line the empire will spend a century apologizing for. The camps, civilians, mostly women and children corralled behind wire into concentration camps, a term that will curdle in the next century. Supplies lag, sanitation fails, disease blooms. Tens of thousands die, not by bullet but by diarrhea and neglect. Emily Hobhouse, a British activist, walks through the barracks, writes what she sees with a clarity that can't be ignored, and forces a public conversation the generals would rather bury. The empire can be merciless. It can also be both facts are true at once. By 1902, fatigue wins. The Treaty of Ferrenaging ends the war. The Boer republics become British colonies with promises of self-government later. The empire tells itself a comforting story. Tough love, lessons learned, reconnect the world with rail and law. But in the scars of southern Africa you can read the 20th century's script industrial war, civilian suffering, ethnic bitterness, resource politics. High noon has shadows. Across the empire a pattern hardens. Survey, build, extract, police. Lay down rail and you lay down expectation that people and things will move when you tell them to. Telegraph the metropole and you make decisions faster than consciences can keep up. Use the Maxim gun and you teach whole regions that resistance requires reinvention. Meanwhile, London turns empire into spectacle and syllabus. The 1897 Diamond Jubilee marches, regiments from every corner, past a monarch who has outlived her enemies and become an era. Postcards travel faster than ships. Schoolboys chant that the sun never sets. Exhibitions teach visitors that empires are museums, where everything has a label and the labels are always right. They aren't. Underneath the brass bands and broadsheets, subaltern elites are quietly aggregating another lesson. If organization is what gives the empire reach, organization can give the colonized voice. Lawyers in Lagos, journalists in Calcutta, dockworkers in Kingston, clerks in Cairo, miners in Kimberley all learn the grammar of modern power. Registers, unions, petitions, protests, tools borrowed from the empire's own box. High noon never lasts. Lights that bright produce heat, and heat makes the air shimmer. If you squint, you can already see trenches on the horizon, and lines of men from across the empire wearing the same drab cloth, marching into a European meat grinder. The map is about to learn a new lesson. Empires can look invincible and still be one bad summer away from bleeding out. Asterisk. August 1914 smells like cut hay and hot iron. Mobilization posters go up on brick walls from Melbourne to Montreal. Brass bands tune up in Kingston and Calcutta. Britain declares war on Germany after the invasion of Belgium and the Empire. Reality, a web of dominions, colonies, protectorates, and mandates begins to move like a single, vast organism. At first, there is pageantry. Indian cavalry trotting through French villages. Australians and New Zealanders in broad-brimmed hats learning the taste of Turkish dust at Gallipoli. South African troops hauling guns through the arid emptiness of German Southwest Africa. West. Indian Labour battalions unloading shells in rain-slick ports. The Empire's promised it could marshal resources from everywhere to fight anywhere suddenly becomes a logistical miracle and a moral question. On the Western Front, the miracle dies in mud. Men from Punjab share trenches with men from Yorkshire and Ypres. Snow finds its way into boots, lice into seams, shells into skulls. Sikh soldiers write letters home about the white fog and the way Europe smells after rain and artillery. In East Africa, a phantom war, General von Lettervorbeck leads a German column that refuses to die, dodging and striking across impossible distances. African porters die in numbers that barely made it into the ledgers the officers carried. In Mesopotamia, Iraq, British and Indian troops slog upriver against Ottoman defenders, ending in the humiliation at Kut in 1916, starvation, disease, surrender, and a death march into captivity. Then there is Gallipoli, a bold idea that the Dardanelles might be forced, that Constantinople might be threatened, that the war might be shortened. ANZ AC troops land in the wrong coves. Cliffs sneer. Turks dig in. Months of courage achieve inches of ground and oceans of grief. From that failure, nations are made. Australia and New Zealand shape identity around courage without victory. But the empire learns that bravery can't outvote bad maps and better defenders. War accelerates promises. In 1917, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration, a letter that speaks vaguely but fatefully of supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while insisting the rights of existing non-Jewish communities not be prejudiced. In the same season, London also issues messages to Arabs about independence if they rise against the Ottomans. Lawrence of Arabia rides through legend. Fissel's men raise the flag in Damascus. Meanwhile, in secret Sykes and Picot draw lines through Ottoman provinces, foreshadowing a mandate system where Britain and France will prepare peoples for self-rule while ruling them. The home front fractures. Ireland erupts first. The 1916 Easter Rising is part tragedy, part prophecy badly timed, quickly crushed, and yet the executions that follow melt the centre. By 1919, Dublin streets hear a new kind of gunfire. By 1921, a treaty carves Ireland into two, birthing the Irish Free State and planting the seeds of another century's troubles in the north. It is the empire's first modern retreat in the heart of its own archipelago in India. Wartime recruitment and taxes deepen resentments. Hopes raised by rhetoric hit the concrete floor of reality. In 1919, in Amritsar, a crowd gathers, a mix of protest, grief, and ordinary errands in a walled garden. Brigadier General Dyer brings troops, blocks the exits, and orders fire. The shooting lasts minutes that feel like forever. Bodies pile. A crawl is ordered on a public street as punishment. News travels slowly, then all at once, the empire's self-image improving, just restrained cracks in full view. In London, Dyer is hauled across a moral stage. Some defend him, many do not. In India, moderates become radicals overnight. A young lawyer in a homespun shawl concludes that obedience is a choice, and he chooses salt. The war ends with victory and funerals. The British Empire sits at the treaty table like a colossus. Dominions sign their own names. Mandates are distributed as if a globe were a prize wheel. Iraq and Palestine under British tutelage. Transjordan invented with a stroke. German East Africa split, with Tanganyika falling to Britain. The League of Nations wraps conquest in a mission statement. Civilize, prepare, uplift. The empire's vocabulary absorbs the euphemism eagerly, but the war has changed the chemistry of rule. Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and blood-soaked legitimacy and demand autonomy to match. The Statute of Westminster will put that on paper in 1931. but the relationships are already evolving. Colonial subjects fought for a king and a flag that didn't always fight for them. They return home with new eyes and unanswered questions. How can a man be trusted with a Lewis gun in Flanders, but not with a ballot in Lagos? Economically, the empire inherits debt and opportunity. Sterling remains a lighthouse. London's banks are still the global clearinghouse, but war taught governments that they can plan economies from the center. The habits of rationing and price controls will ebb, but the belief that the metropole can and should direct the peripheries, production will cling. Culturally, the war rewires memory. Cenotaphs rise in small towns across the dominions, and the UK Remembrance Day punctures the year with silence. In Amritsar, a well becomes a shrine. In Dublin, the General Post Office is both ruin and altar. Empire is no longer just a parade. It is a list of names on a cold morning and a conversation at dinner tables about what those names purchased. Between 1918 and 1922, the empire looks like a winner. It's bigger on the map than ever. It polices Mesopotamian deserts with RAF biplanes. And budget logic. It writes constitutions for peoples who didn't ask for one. But Victor's logic can be the most dangerous kind. The same war that made Britain first among empires also made nationalism a pandemic, taught the world the grammar of mass politics, and seeded doubts in every garrison town that a flag can keep a promise forever. The next 20 years will test whether an empire powered by ledgers and ships can survive mass movements, mass unemployment, and ideologies that despise everything Victorian about it. Spoiler, it can't, not for long. Asterisk, the 1920s open like a window and close like a trap. In Cairo, a boy waves a new flag. Egypt, nominally independent in 1922, though British officers still sit where decisions sit. In Baghdad, a king is chosen in a staged plebiscite Hashemite crown on British strings. RAF planes the final argument behind every governor's desk. In Delhi, a barrister in round glasses salts the sea and invites an empire to arrest a principal. In Dublin, a new state learns to bury its dead and govern its living at the same time at Westminster. The empire is managed by memos. The 1926 Imperial Conference produces the Balfour definition. The UK and the Dominions are autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 will turn that phrase into legal muscle. It's a kind of imperial aikido, transform restlessness into partnership. Call it Commonwealth, keep the crown, lose the leash. In India, partnership is not on offer. The 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms are a constitutional, half-step, limited provincial responsibilities handed to Indian ministers under the watchful eye of governors. It's diarchy, a word that tastes like compromise and feels like patronage. Gandhi's non-cooperation movement withdraws Indian bodies from imperial machinery schools, courts, councils. Charkha's spin. Cardi replaces Manchester cloth. Jail becomes an address. The movement ebbs after violence at Chauri Chaura. Gandhi withdraws in grief. The viceroy exhales. But the chemistry has changed. Swadeshi is an economic model and a moral catechism. In the mid-1920s, new leaders rise Nehru with internationalist fire, Patel with organizational steel, Gina with loyally precision and a fear that majoritarian nationalism will swallow Muslim rights. The stage is crowded. The script is being revised. Daily, Africa feels the empire in prices and boots. The slump of 1920 to 21 hits cash crop colonies like a hammer. Cocoa farmers on the Gold Coast organize. Nigerian dockworkers strike. The white settler states of Kenya and Rhodesia lobby for more land, less labor rights, better rail rates. Trusteeship becomes the guiding fiction. Britain as guardian for a ward too young to manage himself. The ward keeps asking the same radical question: who made you my guardian? In the Caribbean, labor grows a spine. Sugar prices crash. Estates clamp down. Black workers, held in a pre-emancipation shadow by debt and law, discover unions as a new grammar. By the mid-1930s, strikes and riots flare from St. Kitts to Trinidad, from Belize to Jamaica. A generation of leaders learns its first speeches. In cane fields and waterfronts, Bustamante and Manley in Jamaica, Butler in Trinidad. You can draw a line from those picket lines to prime ministers' desks in the 1960s. Asterisk. Then the world falls down an elevator shaft. The Wall Street crash of 1929 turns into a Great Depression that eats savings, currencies, and politics. Britain abandons gold in 1931, a sacrilege that becomes survival. The Ottawa Conference of 1932 sanctifies imperial preference, tariffs that tilt trade toward the empire's own. It's a defensive crouch that works arithmetically and fails spiritually. Preference lowers prices in Sheffield and raises hackles in Shanghai. It binds dominions closer and alienates the rest of the world. Free trade Britain is now a managed trade. Britain with a myth problem. The Depression changes the tempo of descent. In India, salt gives way to saltier politics. The civil disobedience movement morphs into a series of confrontations over who writes India's future. Roundtable conferences in London feel like theatre in an unfamiliar language. Princes, communal electorates, federation proposals that collapse under their own cleverness. The Government of India, Act of 1935, the longest piece of legislation Parliament has ever passed, hands provinces real authority. Elections in 1937 put Congress ministries in charge in key regions. The British imagine they've found a formula: give them provinces, keep the centre. They've misread both math and momentum. In Palestine, a promise meets a promise, and the ground takes the impact. Jewish immigration resides driven by European anti-Semitism closing fists around throats, and Arab fears turn into strikes and revolt. 1936 to 39. Britain does what it knows: commissions, white papers, police actions. It promises, revises, promises. Again, mandate language speaks of homes and rights. Reality speaks in demolitions and detention. The empire's gift for improvisation collapses where identities are non-negotiable and land is finite. In Ireland, the Free State matures, sheds the oath to the crown, and becomes simply Ire under De Valera. In the north, a brittle peace hardens Stormont, an instrument of Protestant ascendancy, Catholics a restive minority. London files the problem under later. Later will arrive on a rainy night in 1969. In Egypt. Independence is a noun with adjectives: partial, constrained, supervised. The waft party fills streets, kings wobble. British advisors advise with the force of a garrison. In Iraq, rebellion in 1931, 32 tests the new nation, the RAF, built from the air. In the Sudan, indirect rule becomes a doctrine, governed through chiefs. Keep your boots off the mud. Keep your hands on the tax receipts. Anthropology becomes policy. Custom becomes a lever. Culture slips its moorings. In London, modernism breaks Victorian furniture. In Delhi, Two Gauze songs share shelves with Eliot's lines. In Lagos, newspapers teach politics in columns. In Accra, schoolboys read Shakespeare and daydream about Nkrumah. The empire is changing from the inside out by teaching people how to argue with it in its own language. All the while, storm clouds assemble over Europe. Mussolini invades Ethiopia in 1935, and the League of Nations proves the emptiness of its vows. Britain and France mumble sanctions while Haile Selassie pleads. In Geneva, and Italians drop poison. The civilizing nations blink. Credibility leaves the room. In Asia, Japan dismantles Manchuria and eyes European colonies like ripening fruit. Appeasement Chamberlain's desperate bet that grievances can be finessed buys time for British. Factories to birth hurricanes and Spitfires, for radar towers to sprout along chalk cliffs. Time is the only commodity left. By 1939, the empire is a paradox made visible, a commonwealth with real autonomy wrapped around a colonial core held by force and habit. A financial network without equals strapped to economies that swing with commodity. Price is a moral story of order and improvement, bleeding from too many self-inflicted cuts. It is also an arsenal, a fleet, and a will to survive written over centuries in storms and sieges. The gun that starts the next war will be fired in Europe. The men who answer it will come from everywhere again. And this time, when the shooting stops, the empire will discover that the very act of winning can break what it meant to be. Asterisk sirens slice the night. Somewhere east of London, a glow crawls. Up the horizon, orange and wrong, as if dawn got lost and set down in the wrong neighborhood. In the tube, families on blankets pretend sleep is possible, while boots clatter on the platform and a warden's whistle tries to organize fear. If you close your eyes, Britain sounds like metal, rivets punched through ship holes, the clack of Enfield bolts, the insect buzz of aircraft you pray are one of ours. This is a war measured in decibels and ration book sand. It draws soldiers, sailors, and laborers from 5 continents into a single, grinding sentence. The opening paragraphs are disaster poems. Poland falls, Norway slips. The Low Countries blitzed into memory. British troops cross to France, then race backward toward the sea as if the continent itself tilted. Dunkirk, a miracle built out of terror and tide charts. Destroyers and drifters, ferries and fishing smacks packed beaches with hope. Reversing the arrow of war for 338,000 souls, while Stukas stitch the water with machine gun. Spray. The army is saved, the equipment is not. It isn't victory, it's a second chance, and then the island stands alone. The Battle of Britain is a fistfight in the sky, fought by teenagers with wings. Spitfires and hurricanes rip contrails into high, cold air. Radar stations blink out warnings. Pilots with names from everywhere, Polish, Czech, Jamaican, Canadian climb to meet Messerschmitts and Henkels that arrive like a tide that refuses to take no for an answer. Churchill gives the line, school kids will memorize their finest. But the secret weapons are quieter, a coastal chain of radio masts that see through clouds, and a code-breaking factory at Bletchley Park where patience and math pry open Enigma's armoured diary. The Luftwaffe blinks first. London survives, singed and stubborn. The Blitz leaves basements full of smoke and songs. Rationing teaches a nation to count its butter the way it counts its bullets. Across salt water, the empire moves. In the middle, East, British and Indian formations roll north to choke off a Vichy-held Syria and to topple a coup in Baghdad. In East Africa, Ethiopians march with British brigades to evict Mussolini's dream of empire. In North Africa, an empty map turns into legend. Tobruk, Gassala, Il Alamein, names that taste of diesel and grit. Rommel's panzers lunge. British Eighth Army, stiffened by South Africans, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, and Brits, digs in and learns to fight in a theatre where distance is the real general. Montgomery's set piece at El Alamein stops the German advance by pulverizing it with method, not magic. This is not the end, Churchill says afterward. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The Atlantic is a separate war entirely, fought in cold rain by men whose world is steel and horizon. U-boats hunt in packs. Liberty ships roll out of American yards like loaves of bread. Corvettes buck through grey water and listen for the faintest ping of a hostile propeller. In huts at Bletchley, women in cardigans rewrite fate with pencils and logic. In Washington, Lend-Lease opens a spigot, tanks, planes, canned meta-torrent of stuff that turns Allied scarcity into momentum. The special relationship isn't romance. It's an invoice with affection stapled to the top dot. And then the Empire's mask slips in the east. December 1941 detonates a theater. Pearl Harbor drags in the United States. Japanese columns crash down Malaya like a waterfall. Impregnable Singapore falls in weeks, the largest surrender in British military history. 80,000 troops herded into captivity under white flags that feel like funerals. Hong Kong collapses. Rangoon is evacuated. The Burma Road breaks. British prestigious. So much of empire is theatre shatters, like glass on concrete dot in the jungle. The war becomes a green nightmare. Heat presses, leeches find everything. Tracks turn into traps. Indian divisions relearn fighting at close range. The 14th Army, the forgotten army, bleeds for ground nobody in London can pronounce properly. The Chindits hack landing strips out of forest and fly in behind the lines. Heroism and questionable strategy mix like sweat and monsoon. At Impol and Kohima in 1944, Japanese offensives smash into defensive rings that refuse to break hilt. Tennis courts become battlefields. Men fight hand grenade for hand grenade. When you go home, tell them of us and say, reads the Kohima epitaph, for your tomorrow we gave our today. The line is older than the war. It fits perfectly. India's role is not only military, it is moral and combustible. The Indian Army becomes the largest volunteer force in history, more than 2 million strong, fighting from North Africa to Italy to Burma. At the same time, the Quit India movement explodes after the failure of the Cripps mission. Gandhi calls for non-cooperation until the empire lets go. Congress leaders are jailed. Crowds flood streets. The Raj responds with sticks and statutes. Subhas Chandra Bose takes another path, raising the Indian National Army from pose captured by Japana, force that fights beside the Japanese while asserting an Indian flag. The war writes contradictions into every family. Then famine. In 1943, Bengal starves. Cyclones, fungus, wartime requisitions, shipping priorities, inflation, hoarding causes not together until the marketplace becomes a morgue. Between 2 and 3 million die not in battle, but in queues. And on verandas relief is late and often misdirected. Arguments about responsibility will persist for generations. What matters in the moment is that the empire that can move tanks from Cairo to Calcutta cannot get rice from surplus to starving. For millions of Indian subjects, the Rogers promise of order breaks on a single, brutal fact: you did not keep us alive. Europe turns. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio British and Commonwealth troops claw up Italy like men climbing a cliff with numb hands. In Normandy, June 6, 1944. Canadians at Juno and Brits at sword punch holes in a coastline fortified by German paranoia and concrete. The 21st Army Group grinds east through bocage and bitter towns. The Rhine is crossed. The war ends in a broken Berlin where the taste in the air is brick, dust and victory. And neither is sweet in Asia. The last act is fast and apocalyptic. British and Indian troops retake Rangoon. The fleet returns to Singapore to reverse the humiliation of 1942. Then to American bombs end arguments in mushroom shapes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders. Flags are raised and lowered. The maps in colonial offices pause, then begin to breathe. Britain has won and is finished. Not finished as a country, not finished as a culture, but finished as the kind of empire that can pretend to rule by right. The bill is staggering. Cities cratered. Merchant ships on the seabed. Sterling shorn of its unshakable aura. Sterling balances mountains of IOUs owed to India and others hang over Whitehall like storm clouds made of numbers. The United States emerges with a bigger economy than everyone else's combined. The Soviet Union emerges with armies parked on half of Europe and a will that will define the next 40 years. There's no room left on the stage for imperial monologues. But the most important cost isn't financial, it's ideological. The Atlantic Charter promised self-determination because it sounded good in 1941. It sounds like a promissory note. In 1945, men who fought in French fields and Burmese hills return home with a simple, radioactive question. If we were good enough to die in your war, why aren't we good enough to govern our own country? There's no good imperial answer. Left, only dates to schedule and trains to arrange. The war has pulled the empire's threads taut across the world. Now they will snap some cleanly with ceremonies and flags, some with blood and slogans, some with lawsuits and silence. The sun hasn't set yet. It's simply lower, and the long evening will arrive faster than anyone in 1939 could have imagined. Heat sits like a hand on Delhi in August 1947. Loudspeakers crackle. Flags wait on their poles. On a desk inside a bungalow, a pen scratches Radcliffe Line onto a map that will decide whether a family wakes up Indian or Pakistani. The man holding the pen has never been to these villages. He works from census. Figures and rivers, like a man divvying a house he's only seen in photographs. Outside, trains are being loaded with history. Independence comes wrapped around a scream. At midnight on August 15th, India is born. Pakistan had taken its first breath. The day before, fireworks in Delhi, prayers in Karachi, speeches in both. In Punjab and Bengal, the border is ablaze. Caravans of humanity creep along road Sikhs and Hindus moving east and south. Muslims west and north while militias and mobs prowl for revenge that has nothing to do with the people they slaughter. Coaches arrive at stations full of corpses. And silence, wells are filled with the dead. Somewhere between 10 and 15 million people cross a new frontier. Perhaps 1 million never complete the journey. In January 1948, Gandhi, who held the country together by moral force as long as any one person could, falls to an assassin's bullet. The old world ends for good on a New Delhi driveway. India and Pakistan are not footnotes to empire. They are the moment the imperial project flips inside out. In the princely states, those anomalies of semi-sovereignty within the Raj Palace intrigues become constitutional crises. Kashmir hesitates, war follows, and a frozen conflict writes itself into Himalayan valleys that will echo with artillery. For decades, Hyderabad's Nawab tries to stand alone. New Delhi sends police and soldiers to end the fantasy. Junagadh's odd gambit toward accession with Pakistan collapses into a referendum. The subcontinent learns the modern art of being a nation by improvising it live. The British leave quickly, elsewhere, too. Burma, Myanmar steps off in 1948, grief already braided into its flagong sarn. The independence architect, murdered months before freedom. Ceylon, Sri Lanka takes dominion status peacefully the same year. A small island sure of itself and unaware of the ethnic fracture lines the future will deepen. Palestine collapses from mandate into war in 1948. Britain, exhausted and blamed by all sides, walks away. Israel declares independence. Arab armies march. Refugees spill into camps that will become cities. The imperial caretakers exit through an argument that has not ended yet. But the empire, stubborn as an old habit, tries one last performance of might. Egypt, 1956. President Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, and British blood pressure spikes. From Whitehall to the city, the plan that Paris, London, and Jerusalem secretly coordinate an attack, that Israel strikes Sinai, that Britain and France intervene to protect the canal and decapitate Nassarids like a clever schoolboy's essay. It collapses under adult reality. Eisenhower says stop. Sterling wobbles. British troops who fight superbly are ordered to halt in mid-victory. Suez is the humiliation you can't spin, a confirmation that empire without American permission is theater. The old lion still has teeth. It just discovered who controls the zoo. After Suez, the script changes. There are still hard fights, there will be more, but the center of gravity slides from forever to when. In Malaya, the emergency 1948 to 1960 pits. Commonwealth forces against a communist insurgency in hot green hills, where every rubber tree could hide a rifle. The British, chastened by counterinsurgency failures elsewhere, get clinical. The Briggs Plan resettles villagers into new villages, cuts guerrillas off from food, and pairs force with political reform. It is ugly, effective, and controversial. In 1957, an independent Malaya takes a flag with a crescent and a sun, and the colonial High Commission mansions discover they can host national cabinets just fine in Kenya. The rebellion does not fit neat case studies. Mo is part oath, part land hunger, part nationalist fury, and all trauma. White settlers dig in. The colonial state declares emergency. Detention camps blossom behind euphemisms. Torture and hangings stain the paper trail. The war ends with a political settlement and then independence in 1963. Jomo Kenyatta raising a flag and then raising a country that will argue with its ghosts in public for generations. In the 2010s, British courts will hear old men and women describe what was done to them in their youth and award damages. The empire's filing cabinets could not keep everything locked. West Africa's path is different. Negotiation set to drums. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, goes first in 1957. Kwame Nkrumah's smile and cadence sending electricity across a continent. Nigeria, a giant stitched together out of 3 unwieldy regions, follows in 1960. The wind of change. Harold Macmillan calls it in a 1960 speech to a hostile South African parliament. acknowledging publicly what civil servants had been. Writing privately for years, the age of colonial rule is over. Sierra Leone 1961, Tanganyika 1961, merging into Tanzania with Zanzibar 1964, Uganda 1962, Kenya 1963, Malawi and Zambia 1964, Botswana and Lesotho 1966, Barbados and Guyana and Barbados, again in domino sequence ceremonies, blur into each other. A governor's pen becomes a president's. Union Jacks come down. New flags try catching wind without tearing. Cyprus is a detour into the familiar EOK bombs. British patrols, collapsed talks, and, finally, independence in 1960 with British sovereign base areas carved out like bites. Aden is Grimmerobin. Ambushes, airstrikes in the hinterland, and 1967's hasty exit as the South Arabian Protectorate boils over into revolution. In the Persian Gulf, the Protectorate's Kuwait, independent 1961, Bahrain, Qatar, and the 7 sheikdoms that will become the UAE move from British tutelage to sovereignty within a decade. Some with British officers still in their ministries, as consultants on Monday and guests at independence receptions on Friday. The Caribbean writes its own chapter, melodic and stubborn. The West Indies Federation 195862 flickers, then fails, killed by distances and local pride. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago go first in 1962, Barbados in 1966, Guyana the same year. The Bahamas will come in 1973, others will follow. Migration, the quiet air of empire, begins to reverse the flow. The HMT Empire Windrush docks at Tilbury in 1948, and with it comes a generation ready to rebuild post-war. Britain for wages and a welcome that will sometimes be a handshake and sometimes a fist. Notting Hill burns in 1958. Parliament answers with race relations acts that try to teach behavior the country didn't think it needed to legislate. In the 1960s, immigration rules tighten. The argument about who is us becomes a national hobby that never ends. South Africa walks its own road out of the imperial family, voting in 1961 to become a republic and leave the Commonwealth rather than loosen apartheid's iron hand. Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, does worse. A white minority unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 dares London to act. Britain applies sanctions and pressure, but will not invade. A long, bitter bush war begins that will only end in 1979 at Lancaster House with the birth of Zimbabwe. That finish line lies just beyond our chapter's date, but you can already hear the gunfire starting in 1966. At home, Britain sheds illusions alongside colonies. The Attlee government builds the NHS and a welfare state on American loans and imperial IOUs while demobilizing a generation into peacetime. Sterling devalues in 1949, again in 1967. Rationing lingers into the 1950s, east of Suez. The global posture that pretended nothing had changed becomes a line item, then a slogan, then a decision. In 1968, the government announces withdrawal from bases east of Aden by 1971. The empire's military spine relaxes. The shoulder ache remains. By 1970, a pattern is clear, even through the fog of case-by-case microdramas. Britain has traded a regimented empire for a messier Commonwealth, a capital E empire for smaller, plural relationships that sometimes feel like friendship and sometimes like family dinners you leave early. It still holds scattered rocks. and harbors Gibraltar, the Falklands, tiny Caribbean and Pacific Islands, bits of pink on school maps that now look like freckles on an older face. The story didn't end in one ceremony. It dissolved, like sugar in tea, until what was left was the aftertaste and the cup. The flag came down in place after place. What didn't come down, what never can are, the systems, the habits, and the human roots the empire left behind, the law codes and railway gauges, the English textbooks and cricket fixtures, the shipping lanes and the surnames. Unstitching a map is easy with scissors. Unstitching lives is slower, and the thread burns your fingers when you pull it. Asterisk grey morning at Tilbury Docks, 1972. Not warships, not troop ships, chartered planes and crowded boats bring men, women, and children expelled from Uganda by Idi Amin. They carry British passports that say one thing and suitcases that say another. Home is an address that moves. A customs officer stamps documents, and then a newspaper photographs 3 generations, standing in British winter coats they've never needed before. The empire is over. The empire is here. This is the quieter, stranger chapter. Not conquest or revolt, but sediment. Colonies turn into nations and then into neighbors. Former subjects become citizens and then become critics, voters, mayors, surgeons, poets. Britain discovers that after you ruled the world for a few centuries, the world lives on your street. South Asian corner shops map themselves across Britain like constellations you can smell, cardamom and cigarettes. Caribbean churches turn warehouses into harmonies. Nigerian and Ghanaian nurses carry the NHS in night shifts. Curry becomes a national meal without anyone voting on it. Politics turns its face outward and inward at once. In 1973, Britain enters the European Economic Community, pivoting from the imperial preference circuits to a continental experiment. In 2016, it votes to leave, promising a global Britain that sounds like nostalgia with a business plan. Trade deals are signed with countries whose very borders were once penciled in by British surveyors. The irony doesn't sting as much as it should because everyone needs customers. Economically, the 1970s scrape, the 1973 oil shock pinches. The 1976 IMF loan humiliates. Headlines scream that the country that once bankrolled half the planet now has to pass a hat with conditions. The empire's old currency, the pound, as the world's comfort blanket, has been retired. The city will reinvent itself as a global money market playground in the 1980s. But first there are strikes, candles, and bins, uncollected. None of this is because of empire in any straight line, but much of it is because the imperial economy was a habit, and breaking habits makes you shake. Then a war explodes out of a map that looked settled. The Falklands, 1982, windswept sheep country, farther from London than the moon in human terms, and 10 weeks away in naval ones. Argentina's junta invades. Britain dispatches a task force that feels like a message to itself as much as to anyone else. The South Atlantic becomes a crucible for technology and resolve exocet missiles. Vulcan raids, Harriers pointing their noses at the sky and telling physics to wait its turn. Marines yomping over hills with cold teeth. The islands are retaken. The dead are buried on both sides. The result is a roar of national confidence and a long diplomatic winter. Empire is gone. Sovereignty, it turns out, still loves a flag. In southern Africa, the last colonial knot tightens and finally breaks. Rhodesia's white trawl adventure ends at Lancaster House in 1979. Zimbabwe is born in 1980 with fanfare and hope that curdles into repression and ruin decades later. South Africa steps out of apartheid in 1994 into a future still negotiating every day with its past. Britain watches as ex-colonies do the hardest human task: build something together after you've been expertly divided. Hong Kong becomes the most elegant curtain call in imperial history and the most fraught. In 1984, the Sino-British joint declaration sets the timer. One country, two systems. 1997 as the handover date. Promises of law and lifestyle protected. For 13 years the city lives with a countdown clock in its head and a stock exchange in its chest. On a humid June night in 1997, the Union Jack slides down a pole for the last time and a Chinese flag rises under rain that looks like a stage effect. The governor sails away. The People's Liberation Army drives in. Millions wake to the same skyline with a different sovereignty. The arrangement holds, then strains, then breaks in arguments and protests that belong to part two of someone else's story. For Britain, Hong Kong is both farewell and mirror, proof that you can leave a place better off than you found it economically, and that you can never leave cleanly. Asterisk. At home, the empire's deepest leftover argument crawls into the light. The troubles in Northern Ireland turn neighborhoods into front lines and strangers into statistics. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement pulls guns back from thresholds and replaces some of them with ballots. Devolution sends power to Belfast, Edinburgh, Cardiff. Sovereignty loosens from the centre like an old belt. The United Kingdom behaves a little more like a Commonwealth, internally plural, negotiated, occasionally tense. In culture, the empire's afterlife is noisy and unstoppable. English, carried by empire and then by Hollywood and the internet, becomes a global commons. Cricket, grafted onto colonies as a gentleman's pastime, returns to lords with Caribbean calypso, Indian television money, Pakistani swing, and Australian sledging, the empire's game now owned by those at once lectured. Football, soccer becomes a Persian Gulf-funded, African and Latin American played. European broadcast world ritual, whose English Premier League may be the most imperial thing left. A cosmopolis of bodies and brands, bringing Lagos and Lahore to a rainy Saturday in Wolverhampton. Museums sit at the center of a moral storm. Glass cases brim with the world. Labels tell stories written by victors. Now the world asks for its things back. The Benin bronzes, Ashanti gold, carved gods from the Pacific dates deeds, and treaties are pulled out of drawers and read aloud. Some institutions begin to repatriate, others explain. Arguments clatter in Parliament and on podcasts. Statues of slavers and imperial champions become lightning rods. Roads must fall is a chant and a syllabus. Cities examine street names. Like their relatives you just now realized you never really knew. None of this is tidy. All of it is honest. Memory stumbles into policy with the Windrush scandal 2018. Where Caribbean Britons who arrived legally in the 1950s and 60s find themselves asked to prove a right to live that they thought was unimpeachable. Files were lost, lives were pinched by bureaucratic doors. Apologies were issued, compensation crawled. It felt like a nightmare found at the bottom of a filing cabinet. It was also a reminder that paper is power, and power misfiles what it finds inconvenient. The monarchy empire's face for centuries changes shape as well. Elizabeth II, who shook hands with more prime ministers and presidents than most countries have had, dies in 2022. Charles III inherits a crown that now sits lightly across 15 realms and symbolically across the Commonwealth. Some members become republics while remaining in the Club Barbados in 2021. Does it with ceremony and side-eye at the pastors' debate referendums. The association evolves into something like a family that meets every few years to promise better behavior and trade notes on climate, trade, and youth programs. It is not empire. It is not nothing. It's proof that relationships can survive. Without ownership abroad, Global Britain tries to be more than a slogan. Trade deals with Australia and New Zealand feel like postcards from an old friend. Entry into Indo-Pacific trade frameworks is both practical and poetic given the old sea lanes. Naval deployments to the South China Sea look like muscle memory. At the same time, the most important flows are invisible. Data, finance, culture. London remains a place where capital changes shape and passports change hands. Universities soak up the world and wring out degrees. Grime, music, and period dramas. Export contradictory versions of Britishness that somehow both sell out, and the territories that never left. 14 remain, some harbours, some rocks, some vacations with constitutions attached to Gibraltar, Bermuda, the Falklands, Anguilla and Montserrat, the Caymans, Turks and Caicos, Pitcairn, descendants of mutineers on an island smaller than Aruma, St. Helena, where Napoleon waited for nothing. They are post-empire fragments with local pride and London backstops, places where sovereignty is a bespoke suit. Each has its own fights: self-government, environmental futures, fishing rights, Spanish claims, Argentine claims, and none has a single story. The most honest way to end this is to admit there is no ending. The British Empire did not close. Like a shop at 5 p.m, it diffused. It became weather. You feel it in the way flights arc across the North Atlantic like stitches. In how courts in Nairobi quote judgments written in London a century ago. In how a Pakistani fast bowler swings a ball at Lord's and an English batter nicknames a curry after a county cricket club. In how a Ghanaian British MP stands up in Westminster to argue for an immigration bill and quotes Thomas Paine. You feel it in the arguments, over statues, over syllabi, over who gets to belong, over whether global is a promise or a euphemism. It is a legacy of infrastructures and intimacies, of wounds and tools, railways and borders, parliaments and prisons, the rule of law and the law of rule. Pride and shame live in the same archive. You don't need to choose one to see the other clearly. For millions in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, empire meant roads and schools, and also hunger and handcuffs. For millions in Britain, it meant cheap sugar, global status, and sons who didn't come home. So here's the only ending that's fair. The empire is gone, and we're still in it. Not in its laws we can change those, though its flags we lowered them, but in its consequences. We speak the languages it spread and argue in the legal idioms it left. We inherit borders it drew and spend lifetimes trying to make them fair. We inherit museums it filled and decide what justice looks like in glass and label. We inherit friendships and resentments and festivals and recipes and a calendar studded with cricket tests and remembrance Sundays. If you've made it this far, 12 parts, 1,000 years, a quarter of the planet, take a breath. History is heavy, but it's also light you can carry forward. The British Empire was mud and muskets, ledgers and law, sugar and steam. Opium and telegraph wire, emancipation and famine, speeches and silence, tanks and treaties, and finally, inevitably people who insisted on their own names. It built and it broke. It connected and it cut. It's over and it's everywhere. Close your eyes. Somewhere a ship's bell rings 8. Somewhere else a child opens a textbook that begins with a map that isn't pink anymore. Between them is the world the empire made and the world that replaced it, imperfect, argumentative, entangled, ours. Asterisk.